Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So I want you to imagine that you are standing at a wooden pulpit.
Okay.
You are trying to deliver this message of hope, of spiritual restoration, and you're looking at a room packed full of desperate, starving men.
Right, a really intense environment.
Extremely intense, because as you look out over those pews, you aren't just seeing a congregation. You are seeing a literal war zone.
Wow.
Yeah. Police officers are flanking you on both sides, and they are, gripping shotguns.
That's terrifying.
And just outside the shattered front windows, there is a heavy machine gun mounted right on the street, pointing directly at your front door.
Unbelievable.
The piano in the corner is smashed into kindling. Hymn books are just torn to shreds across the floor. Tear gas canisters are prepped.
Right, ready to go.
Exactly. And it is your job, right in this very moment, to somehow keep the peace. You got to keep the doors open, and you have to keep feeding thousands of people who have absolutely nowhere else to go.
It sounds like a scene from some dystopian novel, right?
It really does.
But it is very real, very documented moment from the absolute depths of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Because when you are dealing with the extreme edges of human poverty and societal collapse, all those neat, orderly models of urban planning, they just completely disintegrate.
They just fall apart.
Exactly. You are forced to operate in the trenches.
Which is exactly where we are taking you today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are exploring one of the most demanding, intense urban crucibles in American history.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. We are tracing the unbelievable trajectory of the Chicago Christian Industrial League. And we're using a really remarkable source text for this.
Yeah, from 1967.
Right. Written by William Seath. It's titled The Challenge of the Impossible.
And it is such a profound piece of historical documentation. Seath wasn't just some casual observer.
No, not at all.
He was the superintendent of the league during some of his absolute most harrowing years.
Right, he was on the ground.
Yeah. So the text serves as this raw, ground-level analysis. It looks at human survival, the sociology of extreme poverty, and the actual mechanics of institutional resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the mission for you, the listener, on this deep dive is to completely unpack the ecosystem of Skid Row.
It's a complex ecosystem for sure.
We are going to look at the massive historical forces, the economic forces that created this whole army of wandering men.
Right.
And we'll examine those intense ideological clashes of the 1930s. Plus, we want to break down what the author calls operational miracles.
Those are my favorite parts of the text.
Oh, they are incredible. These are these seemingly impossible moments of provision,
yes,
right? And psychological breakthroughs that sustain this massive operation.
When every single economic indicator said it should have completely collapsed.
Yeah, exactly. But before we can even begin to understand the solutions the League proposed, we really have to deeply understand the environment they were stepping into.
You have to know the context.
Right. And the author doesn't just start the clock in 1900 Chicago. He forces us to look at the anatomy of Skid Row and this crisis of the unattached man through a much, much wider lens.
What's fascinating here is how the text frames vagrancy. It's not just some modern urban anomaly,
Right.
It frames it as a deeply entrenched historical constant. Seath pulls the timeline all the way back to the year 1603.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah. He specifically looks at King James I of England. The king attempted to mass deport 80,000 vagrants from the country.
And we just have to pause and really consider the sheer logistical hubris of that.
Oh, it's staggering.
In 1603, the idea of rounding up 80,000 displaced people and attempting to physically exile them across ocean.
Without modern transportation.
Exactly. It demonstrates this fundamental, centuries-old governmental reflex. When faced with the messy reality of deep poverty, the instinct is not to rehabilitate.
No, it's to expel.
Right, to just make the problem invisible.
And that strategy of quarantine remains a constant theme. But as the source moves into the American post-Civil War era, things change.
How so?
Well, the dynamic of the unattached man shifts dramatically. It ceases to be just about sheer poverty, right? It becomes deeply tied to the economic engine of the nation.
Because the nation was rapidly expanding.
Exactly. You had to picture the landscape of late 19th and early 20th century America. The country is exploding westward.
The infrastructure demands were unimaginable. I mean, you have the transcontinental railroads laying thousands of miles of track across brutal terrain.
It required so much labor.
Oh, so much. And the massive lumber industries clearing entire forests in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest.
And ice harvesting, too.
Right, ice harvesting. Cutting frozen lakes apart before the invention of commercial refrigeration.
And all of these industries, they share this one critical characteristic.
Which is?
They require an ocean of grueling physical human labor, but only for highly specific, very short bursts of time.
Ah, yeah. Seasonal work.
Right. You need thousands of men to lay a stretch of track or to clear a timber tract. But the very moment the season turns or the job's done,
they're fired.
Exactly. That entire workforce is immediately liquidated.
Yeah.
They're just let go.
And this creates a highly specific sociological class. I mean, these transient seasonal workers, they were not necessarily destitute beggars.
No, they were the muscle of the country.
Right. They built the American industrial infrastructure, but their entire existence was predicated on constant motion.
Always moving.
They moved with the harvest, they moved with the weather, they moved with the railroad expansions, and consequently, they never put down roots.
No permanent addresses.
Right. No long-term community ties, highly fractured family structures, if they even had families at all.
Which leaves them incredibly vulnerable to macroeconomic shifts. And the text pinpoints a highly specific, devastating shift that completely shattered this transient ecosystem. And it wasn't the stock market crash of 1929.
Wait, it wasn't?
No. The true crisis for this specific population arrived years earlier, during the automation crisis of 1926.
Oh, right. When you examine the historical record provided by Seath, the introduction of massive farming machinery acts as this demographic earthquake.
Specifically, the combine harvester.
Yeah, the combine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is essentially the 1920s equivalent of the modern anxiety we have surrounding artificial intelligence.
Oh, that's a great point, like AI replacing knowledge workers.
Exactly, but on a visceral, physical scale. The combine harvester could suddenly execute the work of 40 men in a fraction of the time.
The sheer scale of the displacement is hard to fathom. We are talking about 3.5 million transient seasonal workers.
3.5 million.
Almost overnight. They found their primary source of income, their entire way of life, completely eradicated by a machine.
Their economic utility just plummeted to zero.
So where do 3.5 million suddenly obsolete, unattached men go?
Well, they follow the railroad lines directly back into the major urban centers.
Naturally.
Yeah, they flood into cities like Chicago looking for any scrap of residual work, any cheap lodging, any place to simply exist.
And this mass migration creates those hyper-dense, hyper-impoverished urban zones that we now colloquially refer to as Skid Row.
Yes.
And the etymology of that term is actually incredibly revealing. The source details it beautifully.
Fascinating.
You hear Skid Row used constantly in modern urban policy discussions, but its origins are intensely literal.
Right. It traces directly back to the logging camps.
Yeah, where those men used to work.
The lumberjacks would construct a physical skid. It was a path made of greased, horizontal logs built right down the side of a mountain.
Oh, I see.
And they would use this path to literally skid the massive harvested timber down to the river for transport.
And the railroad workers use similar terminology, right? For skidding railroad ties into position.
Exactly. Eventually, the specific neighborhoods in the cities where these lumberjacks and railroad men congregated during the off-season.
The streets packed with saloons and cheap brothels.
Yeah, those highly predatory businesses. Those streets became known as the Skid Road.
And over time, as the men lost their economic viability and became permanently trapped in these neighborhoods, the phrase shifted.
From geographical to metaphorical.
Right, a brutal metaphor. A man who had lost his livelihood, his family, his sobriety, he was said to have hit the skids.
Gravity had taken hold.
Yes, sliding uncontrollably down the mountain, ending up on Skid Row.
And Seath's text meticulously outlines the 6 primary causes that foster this ecology of a skid row. It doesn't just happen by accident.
It requires a very specific combination of urban factors to calcify.
Right. First, you have the employment centers, the rail yards, the day labor agencies acting as the initial magnet.
And second, you have the rapid proliferation of cheap flop houses, just built to warehouse these men for pennies a night.
Third, and this is crucial, you have an overwhelming concentration of saloons. Liquor establishments designed to efficiently separate the men from whatever meager daily wages they managed to scrape together.
Just extracting whatever little they had. And fourth, you have the inevitable crowding.
The unsanitary living conditions.
Right, which breed disease and deep psychological depression.
Fifth, you have indifferent public officials. Returning to that King James edict, city governments often preferred to quarantine these areas,
creating an unofficial containment zone.
Exactly. The police simply kept the men from bleeding into the affluent commercial districts rather than addressing the root causes.
But the sixth cause is the most complex, I think, and it deals directly with the internal landscape of the men themselves.
Yes.
It's the profound desire for total anonymity.
This part is so important.
I want us to look at the mechanics of that anonymity, because the author uses a highly evocative analogy here. He compares Skid Row to the biblical pool of Bethesda.
Right.
In antiquity, this was the back gate of the city. Located near the sheep market, where the absolute dregs of society, the paralyzed, the chronically ill, the blind, the completely abandoned, they were just left there by their families.
A designated holding pen for the hopeless.
But if we think logically about modern urban environments, Skid Row is notoriously dangerous. It's unsanitary. It's brutal. Why would a human being actively and deliberately seek out the modern equivalent of the Pool of Bethesda?
Well, this raises an important question about how standard society fundamentally misunderstands deep, compounding trauma.
How so?
When an individual has experienced total systemic failure, whether they've destroyed their career, alienated their entire family due to severe alcoholism, or committed acts that carry immense social stigma, the weight of that shame is often heavier than the desire for physical comfort.
Oh.
So Skid Row, for all its horror, offers a very specific, very dark form of grace. It offers the grace of being completely nameless.
That's a powerful way to frame it. The text explicitly states the unwritten rule of the street. What you have been is your business.
Exactly. Nobody on Skid Row is asking for your resume.
Nobody's asking why you aren't married anymore.
Nobody is disappointed in you because nobody has any expectations of you whatsoever.
Which is precisely why traditional bureaucratic social services repeatedly fail in this environment.
They do, because standard casework methodology operates on extraction.
What do you mean by extraction?
It requires a detailed summary. To get help, you have to fill out forms, provide a background check, trace your family lineage, and explain exactly how you ended up in poverty.
So standard social work demands that you rip the bandage off your shame and present it to a government employee.
Yes, and these men will literally choose to freeze on the street rather than submit to that level of exposure.
They demand invisibility.
They have gravitated to the one densely packed area of the city where they can be surrounded by thousands of people and remain completely unseen.
And that is the incredibly murky, historically complex, and psychologically resistant landscape of Chicago's West Side in the early 20th century.
A massive, concentrated zone of human fracture.
And as the demographics of the city shifted, the traditional established churches looked at this overwhelming, intractable problem. And they largely just packed up and moved to the affluent suburbs.
They abandoned the inner city completely.
They left an absolute void, a total vacuum of care.
Yeah.
And stepping into that massive void is the central figure of the first half of this deep dive.
Reverend George A. Kilbey.
Yes, Reverend Kilbey. We have to examine Kilbey's background because his personal psychology is the blueprint for the entire institution he builds. He is the very definition of a reluctant founder.
His trajectory really defies standard institutional leadership models.
Yeah.
I mean, Kilbey was forced to drop out of school at the age of 10 to perform manual labor and support his impoverished family.
He's a kid.
Yeah, so despite possessing virtually no formal education, he possesses an incredible innate administrative brilliance. He joins the Salvation Army and just grinds his way through the ranks over decades.
He doesn't just participate either. He masters the bureaucracy. He eventually achieves the rank of commissioner, which is an incredibly high-level executive position.
Very prestigious.
He is given command of a territory that encompasses the entire United States west of Chicago. Thousands of personnel under his command, massive budgets, prestige, and ultimate job security.
He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his operational world.
And then, in 1908, over a matter of internal policy dispute, he abruptly resigns.
Just walks away.
Walks away from the entire infrastructure he spent his life building.
And decides to move to Colorado to become a fruit rancher.
Which, when you read Seath's account, is almost comical in its disastrous outcome.
Oh, it really is.
Kilbey was a master administrator of urban missions, not an agriculturalist. The crops failed completely. He lost his investments. He was financially ruined.
And the text is very clear in its theological interpretation of this failure, right?
Yeah, the author frames the Colorado disaster as direct divine intervention. It was the universe or God slamming the door on a comfortable retirement, bankrupting him to force him back to the urban slums of Chicago, where his specific genius was desperately needed.
It is a profound process of unmaking.
Unmaking.
Yeah, he had to be stripped of his executive pride, his institutional safety net, and his alternate career aspirations before he possessed the necessary humility to begin the real work.
Because the reality of what awaited him in Chicago was incredibly bleak.
In 1909, a heavily humbled George Kilbey officially founds the Chicago Christian Industrial League.
And the contrast between his former life as a Salvation Army commissioner and his new reality is just jarring.
Oh, completely.
He secures a small, drafty rented warehouse on 12th Street. Let's just look at the actual inventory of his headquarters at that moment.
It's pretty sparse.
Sparse is an understatement.
Yeah.
He has exactly 2 chairs, and both of them are completely bottomless, just wooden frames. He has a kitchen table with only 3 legs. He literally has to physically nail the 4th corner of the table to the warehouse wall just to keep it from collapsing.
That is resourceful.
He has a single telephone,
Mm-hmm.
and he has an ancient horse and a dilapidated wagon. The ongoing joke among his tiny initial staff was constantly trying to guess, which is older, the horse or the wagon.
It sounds like a punchline, but it is actually a profound physical manifestation of his mission.
How so?
Well, he is tasked with rebuilding shattered, discarded men, and his only physical tools are shattered, discarded pieces of furniture.
Yeah. That brings us to the actual naming convention he chose, which is a masterclass in early 20th century branding and psychological framing.
Right.
He names it the Chicago Christian Industrial League. Every single word carries immense weight. Why use the word league instead of the standard mission? And why heavily emphasize the word industrial?
The author explains that by 1909, the term rescue mission had unfortunately acquired a deeply negative connotation. Yeah, many independent missions of that era were poorly run, financially opaque, and completely disconnected from the broader ecclesiastical structure of the city. They were seen as fringe, sometimes predatory operations.
Oh, I see.
So Kilbey chose League to immediately signal collaboration, structure, and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
But the word industrial is where the true, lasting genius of his methodology resides.
Right. Because Kilbey's operational model wasn't simply to stand on a street corner and hand out tracts. He took that ancient horse and that broken wagon, and he had the men canvass the alleys and back streets of Chicago.
Collecting discarded items.
Exactly. Discarded newspapers, ragged clothing, and specifically broken, thrown-away furniture. They brought this urban refuse back to the 12th Street warehouse, and Kilbey set the men to work repairing it.
And when you look at the mechanics of that, it operates as a brilliant tactile metaphor for spiritual and psychological restoration.
It really does.
What's fascinating here is how far ahead of his time Kilbey was regarding what we would now call occupational therapy.
Yeah, he was a pioneer.
He fundamentally understood that you cannot separate the physical action of the hands from the psychological state of the mind. The text makes a really powerful observation here.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a man who has been sleeping on the concrete, who views himself as completely worthless, basically human garbage. He takes a shattered, discarded chair off the wagon.
Right.
She spends hours sanding down the rough wood. He fabricates a new leg to replace the broken one. He applies fresh varnish.
He takes something society threw away and through his own labor makes it valuable and useful again.
Exactly.
You cannot physically execute that process without the metaphor bleeding into your own consciousness.
Yeah.
You are repairing the chair, but you are simultaneously realizing that you are not beyond repair.
Exactly. It completely circumvents that defensive anonymity we discussed earlier.
Because you aren't forcing the man to sit in a sterile office and explain his failures.
Right. You are standing shoulder to shoulder with him, working with tools, allowing the dignity of manual labor to slowly rebuild his shattered ego.
It integrates physical exertion, psychological healing, and the deep theological concept of redemption, of becoming a new creation.
And Kilbey's foundational philosophy, which he just drilled into the League, was that you must help a man without pauperizing him.
And we really need to define pauperizing for you, the listener, because it's a vital concept in historical charity.
Very vital.
To pauperize someone means to reduce them to a state of total dependency, to make them a perpetual beggar.
It is the danger of the pure handout.
Exactly. Handing a man a bowl of soup keeps his biology functioning for another 12 hours, but it does absolutely nothing to restore his agency. It simply confirms his status as a dependent.
But giving a man a piece of sandpaper, a broken chair, and a small wage for his labor, that gives him his life back. It proves he still has utility.
This industrial engine, the constant collection, repair, and resale of goods, created a self-sustaining ecosystem that allowed the League to grow rapidly.
They acquired bigger buildings, expanded their fleet of wagons, refined their methodology over the next 2 decades.
Kilbey built a brilliant machine, but the true measure of a machine is how it performs under extreme structural stress.
And stress was certainly coming.
Which brings us to the ultimate stress test. The Roaring Twenties come to a catastrophic end. The stock market collapses in 1929, plunging the nation into the Great Depression.
It changed everything.
In 1931, the leadership of the League is officially handed over to the author of our source material, William Seath, and the environment Seath inherits is almost unimaginably bleak.
The transition in leadership coincides with a massive transition in the scope of the crisis. They were no longer just dealing with the specialized population of displaced seasonal workers.
Right, it was much broader now.
They were suddenly dealing with the total macroeconomic collapse of the American middle and working classes.
The statistical reality of what Seath had to manage is absolutely staggering. Listen to the scale of this operation detailed in the text. At the absolute peak of the Depression, the Chicago Christian Industrial League was serving 14,000 meals every single day.
14,000.
They were physically housing 3,500 men every single night across their various shelters. They became the largest program of any rescue mission in the United States.
And they were doing this under financial constraints that defy mathematical logic.
Totally.
The text notes that their primary operational funding during this period came from the Joint Emergency Relief Fund. And the allocated budget to the League to manage this massive population was exactly 13 cents per day per man.
13 cents. We have to look at the sheer logistical gymnastics required to make 13 cents work.
It's almost impossible to conceive.
For 13 cents, Seath had to secure a bed, provide heat in the brutal Chicago winters, pay the staff to supervise the shelters, and purchase the ingredients for 3 meals.
3 meals on 13 cents.
To execute that requires sourcing bulk oats, negotiating with local bakeries for days-old bread that was about to be thrown out, utilizing every single scrap of industrial excess from the city's slaughterhouses.
And relying heavily on the uncompensated labor of the men themselves to cook, clean, and maintain the facilities.
It is logistical mastery operating on a razor's edge. But balancing the budget was only a fraction of the pressure Seath faced.
Oh, yeah.
When you pack 3,500 starving, desperate, deeply anxious men into crowded shelters, you create a massive sociological powder keg.
A literal powder keg.
And there were political forces actively trying to light the fuse. This leads us directly to one of the most intense cinematic moments documented in the book, the communist riot at the Morgan Street shelter.
Right. And it is important to note for you listening that we are examining this strictly as an exercise in historical conflict resolution and institutional management.
Yes, absolutely. The source material presents a specific historical clash, and we are unpacking how the leadership navigated it impartially.
Right. During the deepest valleys of the Depression, communist organizers were highly active across American urban centers.
Because millions of starving, unemployed men represent a highly receptive audience for revolutionary political ideology.
The organizers recognized the massive crowds gathered at the League's shelters as a prime target for recruitment. So they formally demanded the right to use the League's facilities to hold their political organizational meetings.
William Seath and the League firmly refused the demand. They stated that their buildings were strictly dedicated to physical relief and the preaching of the gospel, not political agitation.
And in response, the organizers issued a direct threat. They basically said, if you don't let us hold our meetings, we are going to physically wreck your gospel services.
And they made good on that threat. The text describes a Saturday night service that devolved into absolute chaos.
A coordinated group of rioters embedded in the congregation triggered a massive brawl.
It wasn't just a minor scuffle either, it was a localized war.
Yeah.
The rioters completely dismantled the room, the piano was smashed to pieces, every window in the chapel was shattered, hymn books were ripped apart and used as projectiles.
The violence was so severe that 30 of the rioters ended up severely injured and had to be transported to the hospital.
And the response from the Chicago Police Department was overwhelming. They realized the potential for this to spill out into the broader Skid Row neighborhood, so they locked the building down with extreme force.
Seath found himself trying to conduct the following services while literally flanked by police officers holding shotguns at the pulpit.
Like we mentioned at the start of the deep dive, the police mounted a heavy machine gun on the roof of the building across the street, trained directly on the shelter's entrance.
Officers were stationed at the doors with tear gas bombs, explicitly ordered to drop them at the first sign of a riot and lock the doors, trapping the rioters inside with the gas.
You cannot operate a charity, let alone a spiritual mission, under the constant threat of machine gun fire and tear gas. It creates an atmosphere of sheer terror.
Completely unsustainable.
So Seath had to figure out how to completely defuse this standoff without surrendering the mission's core principles. And his solution is a masterclass in psychological de-escalation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of leadership strategy, Seath understood that relying on the police was a temporary, unsustainable Band-Aid. Force only breeds more resistance.
Right.
So the very next Monday morning, he reached out directly to the top communist leaders in the city and requested a sit-down meeting. He didn't bring the police. He didn't yell. He didn't issue counter-threats.
He offered them a remarkably pragmatic, almost disarmingly simple compromise. What were the actual terms he put on the table?
He looked at the leaders and told them they were absolutely welcome to hold their communist organizational meetings inside the League's Morgan Street shelter. They could have the space.
Wow, okay.
However, the condition was that for every meeting they held at the shelter, the League staff must be allowed to hold a gospel service of equal length inside the organizer's local communist hall.
A strict one-for-one exchange of platforms, that requires an unbelievable level of ideological confidence.
It really does.
Seath is essentially saying, I am so confident in the power of my message that I will hand you the microphone in my building as long as you give me the microphone in yours. Let the men decide.
Yeah.
So how did the organizers react to being boxed in by fairness?
The text notes that the leaders conferred, looked at Seath, and openly admitted that his offer was entirely equitable and fair.
Right.
But they firmly declined it. They refused the exchange.
And the moment they declined a fair compromise, their leverage evaporated.
The riots ceased completely. The threats stopped. The crisis simply vanished because Seath had successfully defended his institutional boundary without resorting to authoritarianism.
He established absolute dominance over the situation by appealing to a universal sense of fair play.
It's brilliant.
And that agility, that ability to adapt instantly to a crisis on the ground, stands in stark contrast to how massive bureaucracies were attempting to handle the transient problem at the exact same time.
Oh, absolutely. The text provides a fascinating juxtaposition with a federal government initiative.
Let's talk about that.
During this same period, the federal government recognized the massive transient crisis and decided to intervene from the top down. They appropriated $2 million, which was a colossal fortune in the 1930s.
Massive amount of money.
Yeah, to construct federal transient camps outside the urban centers.
They bypassed the local missions entirely. They didn't consult Kilbey's blueprints. They didn't consult Seath. They didn't talk to the men who had been running the 13-cent-a-day logistics.
Right.
They just applied massive federal funding and bureaucratic theory to the problem. What was the result?
For a brief, deceptive period of a few months, the population pressure on the Chicago Christian Industrial League actually dropped. Men migrated to the heavily funded government camps.
Okay, that sounds positive initially.
But then, the fundamental flaw of trying to treat deep human fracture with sterile bureaucracy was exposed. The text states the government program abruptly and catastrophically failed.
Just failed.
They closed the camps without warning and completely abandoned the project.
Why did it fail? When you examine the mechanics of the League versus the government camps, it comes down to the concept of the broken chair.
Yeah.
A federal camp can give a man a cot and a bowl of soup, but a federal camp is not equipped to deal with the soul of the man. It is a holding pen, not a rehabilitation center.
And when the camps suddenly shut their doors, thousands of men were instantly funneled right back onto the streets of Chicago.
And the League was forced to absorb the returning masses overnight, with absolutely no warning and no federal funding.
Which brings us to the central mystery of the text.
The operational miracles.
Yes. You have an organization absorbing the overflow of failed federal programs. You have an organization feeding 14,000 men a day on pennies. You have an organization weathering violent riots.
By every standard metric of economics and organizational management, the Chicago Christian Industrial League should have gone completely bankrupt and shuttered its doors.
Exactly. How did they survive? The author points directly to phenomena he categorizes as operational miracles.
These are specific historical instances documented in the text where the brutal mathematical realities of the ledger were suddenly, inexplicably superseded.
By events that the staff could only describe as divine providence.
Let's look at the mechanics of the crisis in the summer of 1935. It is the dead center of the Depression. The League has exhausted all of its credit. They are drowning in debt.
William Seath is sitting alone at his desk. He is staring at a massive stack of past due bills from local merchants and creditors.
Who are understandably demanding payment for the food and coal they've provided.
Right, so Seath runs the numbers. He tallies the entire stack of debt, and the final figure comes to exactly $1,672.37.
It is not a round number. It is a highly specific, idiosyncratic amount down to the penny. And Seath has absolutely zero capital to pay it.
Nothing.
He has walked the streets of Chicago begging for donations. He has tapped every wealthy connection he has. He has hit a solid brick wall. The organization is facing insolvency.
And then the afternoon mail is delivered to his desk.
Ah!
Amidst the letters is an envelope from a man named Frank J. Loesch, a member of the League's board of directors. But Loesch isn't in Chicago. He is away on an extended vacation in New York.
Seath opens the letter, and a bank check flutters out onto the desk. And the letter from Loesch is incredible.
It really is.
He essentially writes to Seath, I have no logical explanation for why I'm doing this. It is the most fiscally irresponsible thing I have ever done.
Right. He says he honestly cannot afford to do it right now.
But while sitting here on vacation, I was hit with an overwhelming, undeniable impulse to go to the bank, completely clean out one of my personal accounts, and mail you every single penny that was in it.
So Seath picks up the check that fell out of the envelope. The amount written on the check, draining Loesch's account entirely, was exactly $1,672.37.
Down to the exact penny of the debt sitting on Seath's desk.
It is a mathematical impossibility for Loesch to have known that specific total.
When Seath recovered from the shock, he wrote back to Loesch, explaining the exact match and calling it a literal miracle.
And Loesch's response was wonderfully grounded.
Yeah, what did he say?
He wrote back, "You preachers are always trying to make miracles out of ordinary men like me."
It is a profound perspective. The text suggests that these operational miracles rarely manifest as lightning bolts from the sky.
Right, they manifest through human agency.
Through ordinary people acting on inexplicable, deep internal promptings that perfectly align with a desperate external need.
But surviving the immediate crush of debt was only half the battle. They needed physical space to house these men.
And this leads us to the story of the Dawes Center in 1939. This is an incredible lesson in real estate negotiation and the absolute necessity of maintaining your core identity under extreme pressure.
To understand the stakes, you have to understand the building. General Charles G. Dawes, a highly prominent figure, had constructed a massive, beautiful hotel as a memorial to his son, Rufus.
Rufus, a tragically drowned.
Right. But prior to his death, he was a university student with a deep, compassionate interest in the men of Skid Row. He would personally organize soup kitchens and distribute food.
So his grieving father builds the Dawes Hotel in his honor, designing it as a model lodging house to carry on Rufus's legacy.
But by 1939, the hotel is failing financially. General Dawes approaches the League and asks them to take over the operation of the building.
We are talking about a state-of-the-art facility valued at $100,000, an astronomical sum at the tail end of the Depression.
And Dawes, along with the bank managing the property, offers the League a lease agreement that is almost too good to be true.
What's the offer?
They offer them the entire $100,000 property for a lease of exactly $1 a year.
$1. For a charity constantly teetering on the edge of financial ruin, this is the holy grail. It is instant, massive expansion for zero cost.
So William Seath and a prominent board member named George Harvey Jones walk into the bank to formally sign the lease.
They are sitting in the boardroom with the high-level bank executives. The lawyers slide the massive contract across the table.
Seath and Jones are reading through the clauses, but suddenly they hit a major roadblock. Hidden in the fine print is a specific stipulation mandated by the bank.
And it reads, "There shall be no religious services conducted in the Dawes Hotel."
George Harvey Jones stops reading. He looks up at the bankers and asks them to verbally repeat that specific clause.
And the bankers confirm it. You get the building, but you leave the religion out of it.
Jones doesn't argue. He doesn't try to negotiate the phrasing. He simply turns to William Seath, closes the contract, and says, "Okay, Bill, let's get out of here."
And he stands up, puts his coat on, and begins walking out of the boardroom.
Yeah.
Now, wait, let's examine this critically. Any modern nonprofit consultant, any pragmatist would tell you to sit back down.
Of course.
You are broke. You are being handed a $100,000 building for $1. You sign the paper, you put the men in the warm beds, and you hold your Bible studies in a different building across the street.
Right, a practical compromise.
Why on earth would Jones risk losing the deal of a lifetime over a single clause?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of institutional drift, Jones's reaction is the precise reason the League survived for decades, while other charities vanished.
Ah, okay.
When the stunned bankers physically stopped Jones at the door and asked if he was truly walking away from a $100,000 asset, Jones articulated the core DNA of the League.
He told them that the League has only one true program: the physical and spiritual rehabilitation of men through the gospel.
He said, if we can't preach the gospel, we have no program. And if we have no program, we are not entitled to the building.
He looked those bankers in the eye and told them that even if they threw in a $100,000 yearly cash bonus on top of the free building, the League still wouldn't take the deal if it required amputating their core mission.
And that absolute, unyielding rigidity broke the bankers. They immediately caved, struck the clause from the contract, and gave them the building on the League's terms.
The landscape of philanthropy is littered with the corpses of organizations that drifted from their founding purpose because they chased grant money, real estate, or societal approval.
By drawing an absolute line in the sand,
Yeah.
Jones protected the genetic code of the mission.
Unwavering commitment to your core identity is what guarantees your survival because it ensures you never lose your actual reason for existing.
And we see that exact same ethical rigor a few years later in 1942. The League needs even more administrative space, and the massive Illinois Bell telephone building goes on the market.
It is a fortress of a building originally valued at $160,000.
Through another highly complex series of negotiations that the author attributes to miraculous timing, the League manages to secure the purchase price for just $25,000.
It's a steal, but they have a major ethical problem regarding how to pay for it.
Right. They had $25,000 sitting in escrow, but that money had been raised years prior during a specific capital campaign designated for a completely different building project that had fallen through.
And ethically, you cannot just take donor money designated for Project A and secretly spend it on Project B.
So Seath and the board initiate an incredibly labor-intensive process. They draft a letter explaining the opportunity of the telephone building.
They mail this letter to every single individual who donated to the original campaign.
They write to the wealthy philanthropist who gave thousands, and they write to the elderly widow who gave 10 cents.
The letter explicitly offers every donor their money back in full or asks for their explicit permission to pivot their funds to purchase the telephone building.
Every single donor, without exception, wrote back and agreed to the pivot.
That is the dividend of extreme institutional integrity. So by the early 1940s, the physical and administrative machinery of the League is locked in.
They survived the Depression, handled the riots, secured massive real estate, and maintained their ethics.
But the text then shifts gears entirely. Having built the perfect physical container, the author details a massive, unprecedented spiritual explosion that occurred within it.
This is a crucial pivot in the book. The author emphasizes that this internal shift required absolutely no strategic planning from the board.
No new marketing campaigns?
No new outreach methodologies, and no special budget. It was entirely organic.
It all begins on a humid, ordinary summer night, July 10th, 1937.
The location is the Friendly Chapel, a small, unassuming room that the men on Skid Row affectionately referred to as the hole in the wall.
It was just a standard evening service. They had a visiting youth group from a local suburban church providing the music and an average visiting pastor delivering a very standard sermon.
But Seath notes in the text that there was a palpable, strange spirit of expectation in the room that night. The staff felt it.
The men were singing the hymns with a bit more intensity. They were leaning forward in the pews, listening to the speaker with an unusual level of focus.
And then, when the pastor gave the standard invitation at the end of the service for men to come forward and pray, something completely unscripted happened.
The pastor didn't have to beg. He didn't have to play emotional music. Before he could even finish a sentence, the men in the audience just stood up en masse and physically rushed the prayer room at the front of the chapel.
23 hardened men off of Skid Row dropped to their knees, weeping, asking for spiritual salvation.
The staff was completely stunned. They were used to grinding out 1 or 2 conversions a week.
Seath went home that night and tossed and turned, wondering if it was just a strange emotional fluke brought on by the heat or the visiting choir.
The staff gathered the next morning in a state of shock. They prayed a very simple prayer. They asked God to keep their own egos out of the way.
To not let them interfere with whatever was happening.
And they waited for the evening service. That next night, 27 men rushed the prayer room. This was the ignition point for a relentless 4-year period that the author officially designates as the Holy Spirit movement.
The statistical scale of this movement defies sociological explanation, especially considering it was centered in a tiny chapel on Skid Row.
In 1938, the League recorded 4,000 professed conversions.
In 1939, that number swelled to over 7,000.
By 1941, over 9,000 men had come through that prayer room.
It became a localized phenomenon. It was so intense, and the crowds pressing into the building became so massive that Seath literally had to contact the editors of the local Chicago newspapers.
And beg them to stop writing articles about the League. They couldn't handle the publicity. They didn't have the physical space for the crowds that were showing up.
They were forced to add a second simultaneous nightly service in another part of the building just to handle the overflow.
But what is truly remarkable, and what speaks to the lasting efficacy of Kilbey's original philosophy of empowering the men, is the specific mechanics of how that second overflow service was operated.
Yes. The staff was already stretched to the breaking point. They didn't have enough ordained pastors to preach 2 services every night.
So the second service was run entirely by the new converts themselves.
You had men standing at the pulpit preaching who, just weeks or months prior, had been blackout drunk in the gutter outside.
And these converts developed this beautiful, unspoken, deeply moving ritual to support one another.
It's an incredible image of psychological safety and solidarity.
The stage would be filled with several new converts scheduled to speak or sing. But the moment one of these men stepped up to the wooden pulpit to begin his testimony, every single other man on the platform would quietly stand up, slip off the stage, and file into the back prayer room.
They would shut the door, drop to their knees, and pray silently for their friend for the entire duration of his message. They wouldn't emerge until he was finished.
These men intimately knew the terror of the pulpit. They knew how fragile their new sobriety was.
How crushing the anxiety of public speaking could be, and how easily a man could stumble.
So they provided this invisible, powerful, spiritual scaffolding for each other. They held each other up in the dark while one of them stood in the light.
So what does this all mean? We have spent a lot of time analyzing the massive macroeconomic forces, the thousands of meals served on 13 cents, the thousands of conversions in the hole in the wall.
But a million statistics, no matter how impressive, do not carry the emotional weight of a single actual human life.
To prove that this massive sociological and spiritual machinery actually worked, Seath dedicates a pivotal chapter of the book to specific case studies.
He titles the chapter, Dead Men Live Again. And these aren't just success stories. They are clinical examinations of how the League's methodology intercepted men at the absolute terminal velocity of their downward spiral.
These stories give profound meaning to the broken chairs and the exact change miracles.
Let's take the time to really examine these case studies because they perfectly illustrate the different facets of how the mission operated. Let's start with a man named Dave and trace his story all the way back to 1912.
Dave's trajectory destroys the stereotype that Skid Row only attracted the perpetually impoverished.
Dave was a highly educated, highly successful young traveling salesman from a very respectable suburban family.
But he developed a catastrophic addiction to alcohol that completely consumed his life. His behavior became so erratic and destructive that his father physically kicked him out of the family home.
And his mother told him never to return.
On New Year's Eve, 1912, Dave has reached the end of the line. He is wandering aimlessly down State Street in the middle of a brutal, freezing Chicago winter storm.
He isn't just cold, his body is actively shutting down. He's experiencing the severe late stages of alcohol withdrawal known as delirium tremens, or the DTs.
For you listening, the DTs aren't just a bad hangover. It is a terrifying, potentially fatal medical condition.
Characterized by violent tremors, soaring heart rates, and intense, horrifying visual and auditory hallucinations, Dave is literally seeing monsters in the snow.
His mind is completely fractured. He forms a singular, grim plan. He's going to walk to the rail yards and throw himself in front of a moving train to end his suffering.
But as he staggers through the blizzard, the physical agony of the freezing temperature overrides his suicidal ideation. He keeps mumbling to himself on a loop, "I gotta be warm, then I'll jump. I gotta be warm first."
He happens to stagger past Popular Hall, one of the League's early meeting spaces.
Yeah.
He doesn't go in for religion. He wanders through the doors purely to escape the lethal cold of the wind.
He sits in the very back row near the radiator, shivering and dozing off in a stupor while the service happens around him. He is entirely disconnected from the sermon.
But as the service ends, a League worker notices him. The worker doesn't hand him a theological tract or demand an explanation.
He simply walks to the back, puts a warm arm around Dave's freezing shoulders, and gently asks if he thinks it might be time to give Christ a chance to fix the mess.
And that simple, warm human contact breaks through the delirium. Dave begins to weep uncontrollably.
He is taken into the prayer room and converted. The League gets him medically stable, puts him to work, and slowly helps him rebuild his shattered mind.
He eventually reconciles with his estranged parents.
But the stunning conclusion to Dave's story is the long-term result. Dave doesn't just survive. He goes on to become the president of the world's largest medical technical training school.
He transitions from a suicidal, hallucinating man freezing on State Street to the executive leader of a massive medical institution.
It is a total reversal of destiny, and we see a similar, though perhaps even more dramatic, physiological reversal in the story of Walter in 1937.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Walter's story involves an immediate, seemingly impossible physiological change.
Walter is a former high-level advertising executive. Like Dave, alcohol has completely dismantled his life.
But Walter's case is so severe that he has been committed to 3 different mental institutions for advanced psychiatric treatment related to his alcoholism.
Nothing works. The institutions release him back to the street as a hopeless case.
Walter staggers into the League's chapel one night in a state of extreme intoxication.
He is so deeply drunk that he loses his balance, collapses, and literally falls over into the center aisle in the middle of the service, disrupting the entire room.
The staff rushes over, picks him up off the floor, and physically drags him into the kitchen. Their immediate goal isn't evangelism, it's triage.
They're trying to pour black coffee down his throat just to get him conscious enough to walk out the door.
But amidst the stupor, Walter keeps mumbling, "I want to pray. I want to pray."
So humoring him, the staff drags his dead weight into the prayer room and manages to prop him up on his knees at the altar.
Walter cries out a desperate, slurred prayer for mercy. And then, according to the multiple staff members who were physically holding him upright, something inexplicable happens.
Walter suddenly stops slurring. He jumps to his feet, looks at the men holding him, and says with absolute clarity, "I'm sober."
And the staff documented that he actually was. The text explicitly states he was instantly, miraculously cold sober.
His motor functions returned. The workers noted with shock that they could no longer even smell the heavy stench of alcohol on his breath, which defies all medical understanding of how alcohol metabolizes in the human body.
But the true miracle wasn't just the sudden sobriety in the room. From that specific moment in 1937, for the rest of his documented life, Walter claimed he never once experienced the biological or psychological temptation to take another drink.
The craving was completely, permanently, surgically removed from his mind. He moved to Ohio, started his own highly successful advertising firm, and spent his weekends volunteering at local rescue missions,
pulling other men out of the exact same gutter he fell into.
Both Dave and Walter were drawn in by intense physical distress, the freezing cold, and the collapse of intoxication.
But the story of Ralph in 1939 illustrates how the mission's reputation reached beyond their immediate neighborhood, and how their strict policy of non-coercion was their greatest evangelistic tool.
Ralph was a Jewish man, a Pride college graduate who had built a fine career and a family, but a series of devastating personal failures led to the total collapse of his life, resulting in a bitter divorce and total isolation.
He's living alone in a dingy rented room, entirely consumed by despair. He makes a firm, calculated decision to commit suicide.
He leaves his room, boards a Chicago streetcar, and heads downtown with the specific intention of renting a high-rise hotel room to jump from.
He is sitting on the streetcar, heading toward his own death, when he glances at the empty seat next to him. Someone had discarded a daily newspaper.
Ralph casually picks it up, and his eyes fall on a specific article covering the Chicago Christian Industrial League's 30th anniversary.
The specific phrase in the headline that catches his eye is the rehabilitation of men.
That one phrase, rehabilitation, sparks a tiny fraction of hope. He tears the article out of the paper, waits for the streetcar to stop, gets off, and walks directly to the mission's headquarters.
But when he walks through the doors, his defensive walls are instantly up. He walks up to the intake desk and immediately announces, "But I'm a Jew."
He is fully anticipating theological rejection. He expects them to either turn him away for being of a different faith or to immediately launch into an aggressive, coercive conversion pitch before offering him a bed.
The desk clerk's reaction is brilliant. The clerk just looks at him, laughs warmly, and says, "So what? You need help, don't you?"
And they immediately process him. They give him a hot meal, a clean bed, and absolutely zero religious pressure. They don't force him to pray for his supper.
And that profound lack of coercion is exactly what disarmed Ralph. Because they didn't force the gospel down his throat, he was willing to sit in the chapel and listen with an open, analytical mind.
The genuine love he was shown broke down his intellectual barriers. He eventually converted of his own free will. He tracked down his ex-wife. They reconciled and remarried.
And Ralph dedicated the rest of his life to leading rescue missions across the American South.
And finally, we have to look at one of the most beloved figures in the book, little Johnny.
Johnny wasn't a former executive or a college graduate. He arrived at the mission at the age of 63.
He was a small, tough man who had worked grueling manual labor his entire life. He was rough around the edges and notorious for swearing like a sailor before his conversion.
But after he found sobriety at the League, he discovered his true calling as a volunteer hospital visitor at the massive Cook County Hospital.
Johnny's methodology is fascinating because he completely threw out every established rulebook on gentle, pastoral bedside manner.
He called his method his razor blade testimony. You have to remember the historical context. This is during World War II.
Resources are strictly rationed across the country. Things like coffee, sugar, and especially high-quality steel razor blades are incredibly scarce and highly prized commodities.
Johnny would walk into a crowded, depressing hospital ward full of sick, suffering men. He wouldn't quietly ask how they were feeling.
He would walk right up to the foot of a bed, look a sick man in the eye, and bluntly say, "Fellow, you look awful."
Which is the most jarring, incredible icebreaker you could possibly use in a hospital.
The patient, usually taken aback, would rub his face and admit that he hadn't been able to get a shave because he didn't have a razor.
At which point, Johnny would reach into his battered shopping bag, pull out a rare, brand new, highly valuable razor blade, and simply hand it to the man.
The patient would invariably be thrilled and try to profusely thank Johnny for this incredible gift.
And Johnny would hold up his rough, calloused hand to stop him and say, "Don't thank me. Thank the Lord, he sent this to you."
And using the razor blade as the physical wedge, he would pull up a chair and launch directly into his own testimony of how God had pulled him out of the gutter.
Using this completely unorthodox, highly practical method, this little 63-year-old former laborer personally guided over 500 men a year to spiritual conversions in those hospital wards.
If we synthesize these stories, Dave freezing on State Street, Walter collapsing in the aisle, Ralph needing a safe bed, and Johnny's hospital patients needing a simple shave, what is the undeniable connecting thread?
In every single case, the initial point of contact between the mission and the man is entirely based on a visceral, physical need.
The physical care earns the right to administer the spiritual care.
Precisely. You see, Kilbey's original founding premise holding perfectly true across decades of operation. You cannot fundamentally separate the message from the ministry.
You cannot preach theological truths to a man who is freezing to death without first wrapping a heavy coat around his shoulders.
You provide the razor blade, you repair the broken table leg, you offer the 13-cent bowl of soup, and in doing so, you rebuild the dignity of the man, making him capable of receiving the spiritual restoration.
What an absolutely incredible, exhausting, and triumphant journey this source text has taken us on.
It's an inspiring history.
We have traced the Chicago Christian Industrial League from George Kilbey sitting in a drafty warehouse with a broken three-legged table, all the way through the massive, crushing social upheaval of the Great Depression.
We've watched William Seath navigate violent political riots with brilliant, unshakable diplomacy.
We've seen an organization survive total financial ruin through literal exact change miracles in the mail.
We've witnessed them secure massive real estate by refusing to compromise their core identity.
And we've explored the massive organic spiritual revivals that saw thousands of men reclaim their lives. And all of it, every single operational victory and every restored life, was driven by their foundational, unyielding belief that with God, all things are possible.
Examining this history forces us to ask a critical, somewhat uncomfortable question of ourselves and our modern methodologies.
Definitely.
We live in an era characterized by overwhelming data, massive, highly funded bureaucratic systems, and yet we are simultaneously experiencing widespread, crushing epidemics of isolation, addiction, and despair.
When we look out at the complex human problems in our own cities, how often do we default to trying to fix them with purely bureaucratic, top-down solutions?
How often do we simply throw a massive government program or a sterilized grant at a problem while completely ignoring the profound, messy, intimately individual need for holistic, psychological, and spiritual rehabilitation?
That is the real challenge laid down by this book. Reverend George A. Kilbey, the man who started this massive rescue engine with nothing but discarded bottomless chairs, was once asked by a reporter what it actually takes to do this kind of grueling, heartbreaking work year after year without succumbing to total burnout.
And his answer was profound in its simplicity. He said, "It takes the kind of enthusiasm that renews itself every day."
So I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Think about your own life,
Your career, your family.
your passions, and the specific challenges you face. What is the actual source of your enthusiasm? When you look out at your world and you are suddenly faced with the impossible, whether it is the metaphorical broken chairs in your workplace, the systemic failures in your community, or the very real broken lives of the people around you. What is the deep internal fuel that allows your enthusiasm, your drive to help to renew itself every single day?